They called him Kaiso, a man dragged from freedom into chains, forced to bleed for the pleasure of Roman masters. 5 years in the pits carved scars across his body, but it was the cruelty in their eyes that carved scars across his soul. The crowd saw only a beast that could not die. His fellow slaves saw something else, a spark of defiance, dangerous and waiting. When the night came and the banquet halls filled with laughter, Queso turned the tables. The masters who fed on blood found themselves drowning in it. And yet, what he did next was more shocking than slaughter. Because Queso was no longer fighting for survival. He was fighting to lead every chained man to freedom. But freedom won in blood has a price, and Rome never forgets. This is the story of the fighting pit slave who endured years of blood sport before slaughtering his masters and lighting the fire of rebellion. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The iron door groaned open, flooding the dark cell with pale morning light. 2 guards yanked Kaiso to his feet, their rough hands leaving fresh bruises on his arms. The shackles bit into his wrists as they dragged him forward, each step echoing against the stone walls. Above, the wooden beams trembled with the thunderous roar of the crowd. The holding area stank of fear and old blood. Other fighters huddled in the shadows, some muttering prayers, others staring blankly at nothing. Queso recognized the hollow look in their eyes, the same emptiness he'd seen countless times before. 5 years in these pits had taught him that prayer helped no one. Only cunning and will kept a man breathing. He flexed his fingers, feeling the familiar ridges of scar tissue that mapped his survival. Each mark told a story. The jagged line across his forearm from a Gaul's sword, the puncture beneath his ribs from a Numidian spear, the burn along his shoulder from when they'd branded him like cattle. But his first scar, the one that started it all, came from the day the Romans stormed his village. The memory rose unbidden, dawn mist clinging to the Thracian hills, the sound of horses, his father's shout cut short by a pilum through the throat. Kaiso had fought with a farming sickle, managed to wound 2 legionnaires before a shield bash knocked him senseless. He'd awakened in chains, his old life forever lost. A commotion above drew his attention. The wooden gallery creaked as 2 figures took their seats in the master's box. Lucullus, the showman, wore a deep purple toga that caught the morning light. His heavy rings glinted as he waved to the crowd, playing the gracious host. Beside him sat his cousin Marcellus, lean and cold-eyed, dressed in practical gray. Where Lucullus craved attention, Marcellus preferred to fade into shadows, managing the bloody business from behind the scenes. "Brothers and sisters of Rome," Lucullus's voice boomed across the arena, "today we bring you something special. Our champion faces not 1 beast, but 3. The crowd roared. Queso's guards shoved him toward the gate. Through the iron bars, he could see 3 separate cages being positioned around the arena's edge. Inside each, yellow eyes gleamed. "Lions," one guard sneered. "Hasn't been fed in days. Should be quick." Queso said nothing. He'd learned early that silence unnerved them more than any threat. The gate cranked open, and he stepped onto the blood-stained sand. The morning sun was harsh after the darkness below. He squinted, taking in the familiar sights. The crowded wooden stands, the betting agents working the aisles, the eager faces hoping to see death. They'd given him a dented shield and 2 spears, one with a cracked shaft, the other missing half its head. Typical. The masters never wasted good weapons on fights they expected to end in death. The first cage door flew open. A tawny shape exploded onto the sand, all muscle and matted mane. The lion circled, ribs showing through its dull coat. The second and third cages opened in quick succession. More yellowed fangs, more hungry eyes. Queso kept moving, his feet tracing familiar patterns in the sand. The first lion charged. He pivoted, driving the broken spear deep into its shoulder. The shaft snapped, leaving him with a useless handle as the beast howled and retreated. The second lion lunged from behind. Queso dropped and rolled, feeling claws tear air where his throat had been. He came up, swinging the shield, catching the third beast in the jaw as it tried to flank him. Bone crunched. The crowd cheered. But he couldn't keep this dance forever. The wounded lion was already circling back, blood matting its mane. Queso retreated toward the arena wall, letting them think they had him cornered. The lions closed in, muscles bunching for the final rush. That's when he struck. He hurled his shield like a discus, catching the wounded lion in the face. In the same motion, he drove his remaining spear into the ground at an angle. The second lion, already mid-leap, impaled itself on the shaft. Its momentum carried it forward, and Queso used its falling body as a shield against the third beast's attack. He rolled free, snatching up the broken spear handle. The final lion turned, snarling. Queso waited until it charged, then stepped aside at the last moment. As it passed, he jammed the jagged wood into its eye. The beast crashed into the wall, thrashing once before going still. Silence fell across the arena. 3 lions lay dead in the sand. Queso stood in their midst, chest heaving, blood running down his arms. He turned slowly, meeting the crowd's stunned gaze. Then someone shouted his name. Another voice joined in. Soon the whole arena thundered with it. "Queso! Queso! Queso!" He looked up at the master's box. Lucullus was on his feet, clapping with theatrical enthusiasm. Even Marcellus had leaned forward, cold calculation in his eyes. Queso knew what they saw. Not just a survivor, but a prize. A champion who could fill their coffers with gold. Let them see what they wanted. Let them think him tamed. He kept his face carefully blank as the crowd chanted his name, but inside, something stirred. Not hope. He'd lost that years ago in these blood-soaked pits. No, this was darker, colder, a patient fury that could wait for its moment. The guards led Queso down a different corridor that evening, away from the usual rank cells. This passage was drier, with actual torches instead of just gaps in the stone letting in light. They stopped at a wooden door and unlocked it, revealing a small but clean room with a real straw mattress on a raised cot. "Champion's quarters," one guard grunted, shoving a bundle into Queso's hands. Fresh bread, still warm. A clay jug that sloshed with wine. Queso stood motionless until they left, listening to their footsteps fade. Only then did he move, touching the bread with cautious fingers, as if it might vanish. The crust crackled under his touch. Real baker's bread, not the moldy scraps they usually tossed to the fighters. He tore off a piece and chewed slowly, savoring the taste. When was the last time he'd eaten bread this fresh? Before the Romans came, surely. Before chains and sand and blood. Voices drifted through his door, other fighters being led past to their cells. Their whispers carried clearly, "Did you see him with those lions? 3 of them! Never seen anything like it. Master's new favorite now. Lucky bastard probably gets real food, too." Queso took another bite of bread, the taste suddenly bitter. Luck had nothing to do with it. Every scar on his body, every callus on his hands, those were earned through blood and desperation. The next morning, they fitted him with new chains. These were lighter, polished bronze instead of crude iron. For show, like everything else the masters did. Lucullus paraded him around the training yard, boasting to visiting nobles about his undefeated champion. "Invincible!" Lucullus proclaimed, clapping Queso's shoulder as if they were old friends. "You should have seen him with those lions, like watching Hercules himself." The nobles nodded politely, but Kaiso caught their sideways glances. To them, he was still just a thing, a dangerous beast to bet on, nothing more. During the afternoon training session, he noticed an older fighter watching him from the shadows. The man had an empty socket where his right eye should have been, the skin around it puckered with old scar tissue. Despite his age and injury, he moved with the careful grace of a veteran warrior. Later, as Kaiso practiced with a wooden sword, the one-eyed man approached. "They call me Nero," he said without preamble. "That was good work with the lions. Creative. Most just try to outmuscle them and end up dead." Kaiso grunted, continuing his practice swings. "Saw how they've dressed you up," Nero continued. "New chains, special quarters. Feeling proud?" "Should I?" Nero's remaining eye narrowed. "Know what happens to champions when they're not useful anymore? Same thing that happens to old horses. They get sold for cheap meat." Kaiso lowered his practice sword. "What do you mean?" "Watch the injured fighters, the ones who can't perform anymore. They disappear in the night, but not to the gods." Nero spat in the dust. "Rich nobles buy them cheap. Use them for private entertainment in their villas. Quick deaths for dinner parties." As if to prove his point, a commotion arose from the cells. Two guards dragged out Caius, a younger fighter who'd badly broken his leg in yesterday's matches. The bone had torn through the skin. Infection had set in fast. "Please," Rufus begged as they hauled him past. "I can still fight. Just need time to heal." But they didn't stop. Kaiso watched them disappear around a corner, Caius's pleas echoing off the stones. "I've been here 8 years," Nero said quietly. "Seen hundreds of champions rise and fall. The masters fatten them up, parade them around, then sell them off when they start to slow. You're just the latest pig being readied for slaughter." "Why tell me this?" Nero's good eye glinted. "Because you're different. You think. You plan. And maybe—" He glanced around before continuing in a whisper. "Maybe you might be interested in certain things I've gathered over the years. Useful, sharp things." Before Kaiso could respond, guards appeared to escort them back to their cells. But Nero's words followed him through the corridors. That night, lying on his fresh straw mattress, Kaiso stared up at the rough wooden beams crossing the ceiling. The wine jug sat untouched in the corner. The remaining bread felt like ash in his stomach. He thought of Rufus being dragged away. How many others had vanished like that? How many champions had slept in this very room, thinking themselves special, only to end up butchered for some noble's amusement? Survival had been enough for 5 years. Every fight, every scar, every kill, all for the simple goal of living to see another dawn. But what was the point of surviving if it only led to a cheap death in some villa's courtyard? The ceiling beams blurred as his eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness. Somewhere in the complex, he heard the clank of chains as guards made their rounds. The sound that had been his constant companion for 5 years now seemed to whisper a question. Was mere survival worth these chains? Worth watching others die? Worth becoming just another beast to be fattened and slaughtered? The morning sun cast long shadows across the training yard as Kaiso methodically sharpened a wooden practice spear. The guards watched from their posts, bored and distant. Their laziness had grown with his new status as champion. They no longer saw him as an immediate threat. The rhythmic scrape of stone against wood helped him think. Each stroke brought the tip closer to a lethal point, though the guards assumed he was merely maintaining equipment. Nero's words from the night before echoed in his mind. Useful things, sharp things. As if summoned by his thoughts, the one-eyed veteran appeared nearby, casually working with his own practice weapon. Their eyes met briefly. Nero gave an almost imperceptible nod toward the old storage shed at the yard's edge. Throughout the morning, other fighters drifted closer, drawn by some unspoken current. Tiro, the red-headed Gaul, loud and boisterous as always, but with a new intensity in his eyes when he glanced Kaiso's way. The massive Nubian called Dymas, silent as death, but watching everything from beneath heavy brows. Quite the gathering of talent, a soft voice observed. Kaiso turned to find Cassian, the young Greek slave, hovering nearby. Unlike the others who bore the marks of combat, Cassian's hands were smooth. He served as a translator and scribe for the masters. "Just maintaining weapons," Kaiso replied flatly. "Of course." Cassian's smile didn't reach his eyes, though one wonders why such attention to mere practice tools. Before Kaiso could respond, Nero interrupted. "Boy, don't you have scrolls to copy?" Cassian withdrew, but not before Kaiso caught the flash of fear in his expression. The Greek's words carried a warning. Planning rebellion was suicide against Rome's might. When the midday sun drove most guards to seek shade, Nero led Kaiso to the storage shed. The old structure slouched against the outer wall, its wood gray with age. Inside, dust motes danced in thin shafts of light. "Watch the door," Nero muttered to Tiro, who positioned himself outside. Dymas stood like a shadow in the corner, his bulk making the small space seem even smaller. Nero knelt and began prying up floorboards with practiced movements. The wood came away silently, revealing a dark space beneath. The veteran reached down and withdrew something wrapped in oiled cloth. "Took years," he whispered, unwrapping the bundle. "A knife here, a sword there. Anything I could hide before they melted down broken weapons." The cloth fell away, revealing rusted but serviceable blades, short swords, daggers, even a few axe heads. Shields, too, their leather rotted, but bronze bosses still strong. "Not enough for everyone," Kaiso observed, counting the weapons. "Enough for the first strike," Nero countered. "After that, we take what we need from the guards. If we survive the first strike." Dymas spoke for the first time, his deep voice barely above a whisper. "Better to die fighting than end up sold to some noble's villa," Tiro growled. Kaiso lifted one of the short swords, testing its weight. The blade was pitted, but the edge still held promise. "How many fighters would stand with us?" "Most of the veterans," Nero said. "The ones who've seen friends disappear. The newer ones," he shrugged. "Fear makes men unpredictable." "Like that Greek rat," Tiro spat. "Did you see how he watched us? We should silence him before—" "No." Kaiso's voice cut through the air. "No killing slaves. We're not the masters." Nero nodded approval, but Tiro scowled. "Your mercy might get us all killed. And killing our own might damn us worse than chains," Kaiso replied, rewrapping the weapons. "We're not animals, whatever they've tried to make us." They carefully replaced the floorboards. As they emerged from the shed, Cassian was there again, pretending to sweep the yard. His eyes darted between them, questions clear on his face. "Rome's reach is long," he said softly, as Kaiso passed. "No slave revolt has ever succeeded. The legions always come. Always. Then we'll be the first," Kaiso replied. But he saw the doubt in the young Greek's eyes. More than doubt, terror of Rome's inevitable vengeance. That evening, as Kaiso was being escorted back to his cell, he noticed one of the guards had grown sloppy with comfort. The man's dagger hung loose in its sheath, bouncing against his hip as he walked. One practiced move was all it took, a stumble, a brush of hands, and the blade vanished into Kaiso's palm. The guard never noticed. Back in his cell, Kaiso waited until the footsteps faded. Then he pried up a loose stone in the floor, one he'd been working on for months. The dagger fit perfectly in the space beneath. He replaced the stone and sat on his cot, feeling the weight of the hidden blade like a promise. Not a practice weapon, not a dulled tool, but a real weapon of his choosing. The first of many, if Nero's cache proved true. Tomorrow would bring another dawn, another day of pretending to be the master's tame champion. But now, lying in the darkness, Kaiso felt something he hadn't experienced since before his capture, the stirring of real hope, not just for survival, but for freedom. He thought of Cassian's fearful warnings about Rome's might. The young Greek wasn't wrong. The empire's reach was long, its vengeance terrible. But as Caeso drifted off to sleep, his hand resting on the floor above his hidden blade, he smiled. Rome had never faced men with nothing left to lose except their chains. The feast hall blazed with torches, laughter echoing off stone walls as wine flowed freely. Lucullus presided over the gathering like a bloated spider, his purple-trimmed toga stained with sauce as he gestured with a wine cup. Below his raised platform, wealthy guests reclined on cushioned couches, grazing from platters heaped with roasted meats and exotic fruits. "To my champion!" Lucullus called out, raising his cup. "The Thracian who cannot die." Caeso stood in the shadows near the hall's entrance, where slaves were meant to wait until summoned. His wrists bore ceremonial chains, light bronze things meant for show rather than restraint. The masters enjoyed displaying their tamed gladiator to important guests. "Come, Thracian!" Marcellus beckoned from beside his cousin. "Tell these good people how many beasts you've slain in our arena." Caeso stepped forward, playing the role of the obedient champion. As he moved through the crowd, he counted the guards. Most were already deep in their cups, their weapons loose in their sheaths. Perfect. 12 lions, he announced, pitching his voice to carry. 3 bears, 2 tigers. He paused for effect. And tonight, 2 masters. The last words were lost in the general revelry. Only Marcellus seemed to catch them, his brow furrowing slightly before he dismissed the threat. After all, what slave would dare? Through the window slits high in the walls, Caeso saw the moon had reached its zenith, the signal. He retreated to the shadows again, watching as Nero and the others slipped away one by one. The guests were too drunk to notice the careful choreography of slaves moving through the darkness. Even the guards had grown lax, many abandoning their posts to steal sips of wine from unattended cups. Caeso made his way to the storage shed, where Tiro and Dymas were already distributing Nero's hidden weapons. The rusted blades looked beautiful in the moonlight. Better still were the sharp swords they stripped from the first 2 guards they ambushed. Clean kills, bodies hidden in the shadows. They moved through the estate like ghosts, targeting isolated guards. Each death was silent, efficient. Years of fighting in the arena had taught them all they needed to know about killing. When they reached the kitchen, they found Nero had already gathered a group of house slaves, men and women who had suffered their own torments under the masters. They clutched kitchen knives and cleavers with white-knuckled determination. "The Greek?" Caeso whispered to Nero. "Cassian's locked in the scroll room," Nero replied. "Chose his own fate." Caeso nodded. Better imprisonment than murder, even if the young man's fear might have doomed them all. They assembled in the corridors leading to the feast hall. The sounds of drunken revelry had grown louder, more raucous. Through the doors, Caeso could hear Lucullus describing his latest acquisition, a group of captured Britons destined for the fighting pits. "Now!" Caeso breathed. They burst through every entrance simultaneously. Caeso led the charge through the main doors, his stolen sword already wet with guards' blood. The first moments were chaos, screams of surprise turning to terror as blade met flesh. He cut through the crowd like a reaper through wheat, making straight for the master's platform. A guard tried to block his path. Caeso gutted him without breaking stride. The man's sword clattered to the stone floor as he fell. Lucullus struggled to rise from his couch, wine spilling across his toga. "Seize him! Kill him!" But the remaining guards were overwhelmed, fighting for their lives against vengeful slaves, armed with years of combat experience. Dishes crashed to the floor as guests fled in panic, their fine clothes spattered with blood and wine. Marcellus proved braver than his cousin, drawing a jeweled dagger from his belt. He managed one wild slash before Queso caught his arm and drove his sword through the master's throat. Arterial blood sprayed across the feast table, staining white linens crimson. "Please," Lucullus begged as Queso turned to him. "I gave you everything, made you champion. You gave me chains," Queso replied. "Now I give you death." The blade went in just below the ribs, angled up toward the heart. Lucullus made a wet sound and toppled forward onto his beloved feast table, his blood mixing with spilled wine. Throughout the hall, the fighting was already ending. Most guests had fled. Those guards who hadn't been killed had thrown down their weapons, begging for mercy. Some slaves were already taking up torches, setting fires to create smoke and confusion for any pursuers. A handful of overseers had escaped in the chaos, disappearing into the night. They would carry word to nearby estates, to the Roman authorities, but that was tomorrow's problem. By midday, they'd reach the nearest garrison at Antium. By nightfall, scouts would be combing the hills for us. Queso walked through the carnage, checking his people. They had lost some, brave souls who had bought their freedom with their lives. But most had survived, their chains literally and figuratively broken. He found Nero directing slaves to gather weapons and supplies. The older man's face was blood-spattered, but calm. "The estate is ours," he reported. "For now." Tiro and Dymas were organizing guards to watch the walls, using skills learned from years of observing their own captors. The house slaves were already looting the master's quarters, taking what they had been denied for so long. As dawn's first gray light crept into the sky, Queso stood in the courtyard. The bodies of Lucullus and Marcellus had been dragged there, thrown down like the garbage they had always considered their slaves to be. Around him, his blood-soaked companions moved with purpose, securing their temporary fortress. They had won their freedom, but Queso knew the real fight was just beginning. Beyond the estate walls, the countryside belonged to Rome. Every village, every road, every watching eye would be a potential threat. He looked down at his former master's corpses, so small in death. Their fine clothes were soaked through with blood, their faces frozen in final shock at their slaves' rebellion. They had believed their power absolute, their position unassailable. They had been wrong. Dawn painted the hills in shades of amber as Queso led the survivors away from the smoking ruins of the estate. 20 men trudged behind him, their backs bent under the weight of stolen supplies. Sacks of grain bounced against shoulders, wine jugs clinked in makeshift slings, and dried meat-filled leather pouches that had once held their master's coins. Nero had them count rations by handfuls, not cups. Queso set a 3-day issue, no more, no less, until they found game or raided again. Behind them, thick black smoke rose from the burning estate, like a signal flag to every Roman patrol in the region. The fires they'd set had consumed most of the evidence of their revolt, but Queso knew it wouldn't be enough to hide their tracks completely. "We should split up," muttered Tiro, the Gaul's voice rough from smoke. "Small groups draw less attention." "And die faster," Dymas countered, his dark skin glistening with sweat as he adjusted a heavy grain sack. "The Romans will hunt us like wolves. We need numbers." The argument had been brewing since they'd gathered their supplies at first light. Fear and exhaustion made tempers short, and the burden of freedom weighed heavier than any chain. Some men walked with hesitant steps, already questioning their choice to follow Queso into uncertainty rather than flee alone. "We stay together," Queso declared, his tone leaving no room for debate. He pointed to a steep ridge ahead. "The high ground gives us view of the roads. We'll make camp there." A few men grumbled, but none challenged him openly. The blood of their masters was still fresh on his blade, and his reputation from the fighting pits cast a long shadow. More than that, they recognized the steel in his voice, the same unwavering resolve that had kept him alive through 5 years of combat. The climb was grueling. Men unused to long marches stumbled on loose rocks, cursing as they hauled their burdens upward. Kaiso set a steady pace, choosing a path that balanced speed with stealth. When they finally reached a suitable clearing, shielded by thick pines and offering clear views of the valleys below, more than one man collapsed in exhaustion. "Rufus, Philip, establish a watch rotation," Kaiso ordered, naming 2 former house slaves who had proven level-headed during the revolt. "Marcus, begin distributing rations, small portions only. We don't know how long this must last." The men organized themselves with the efficiency of those long accustomed to taking orders. Some gathered firewood, others cleared spaces for sleeping. The terrain was familiar to Kaiso, similar to the Thracian hills where he'd grown up before the Romans came. He identified a sheltered hollow where Nero's spare weapons could be safely cached. As he buried the extra swords and spears, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, Kaiso's thoughts turned to his old friend. Nero would have approved of this spot, with its multiple escape routes and defensible positions. The one-eyed veteran had spent years planning for a moment like this, even knowing he might not live to see it. By midday, the camp had taken shape. Crude lean-tos provided shelter, and a small fire burned in a pit dug deep to hide its smoke. Men sat in clusters, sharing food and wine, their voices low but tinged with an edge of hysteria that worried Kaiso. Freedom was still too new, too raw. "We should raid the nearby estates," suggested Valens, a scarred gladiator who had killed 3 guards during their escape. "Strike before they expect it. Take what we need. And bring every soldier within 50 miles down on our heads?" Kaiso challenged. "We wait. Let them think us fled to the coast. The hills will provide what we need if we're patient." "You're not our master now," Valens shot back, though he wouldn't meet Kaiso's eyes. "We didn't trade one set of orders for another." The words sparked tension through the camp. Men shifted uneasily, hands straying toward weapons. Kaiso stood slowly, letting his gaze sweep across the gathered faces, some defiant, others uncertain, all watching to see how he would respond. "No, I'm not your master," he agreed quietly, "but I've kept us alive this far. The Romans will come looking for revenge. They'll want to make examples of us. Together, we might survive. Divided, we die." His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Even Valens nodded reluctantly, the fight draining from his posture. They had all seen what happened to recaptured slaves, deaths designed to discourage others from dreaming of freedom. The afternoon passed in necessary tasks, setting snares for game, scouting water sources, establishing patrol routes. Kaiso kept them busy, knowing idle hands would only feed their fears. As the sun began to set, he finally allowed himself to rest, settling beside the fire with a cup of stolen wine. The first stars appeared above the trees, bright and clear, in a way they had never seemed through the barred windows of his cell. Kaiso studied them with wonder, his bare wrists still feeling strange without their familiar weight of iron. Pride swelled in his chest, pride in their victory, in their survival, in the taste of freedom after so many years of bondage. Yet beneath that pride lurked a deeper emotion, dread, cold, and heavy as a blade against his spine. He had led these men to freedom, but freedom was a fragile thing. Every moment of peace was borrowed time, paid for with blood, and balanced on the edge of a sword. The Romans would come, as inevitable as the dawn, and when they did, Kaiso took another sip of wine, letting the stars wheel slowly overhead. For now, at least, the chains were broken. For now, they were free men. Tomorrow's battles would come soon enough. The morning dew had barely dried when the arguments began again. 5 days in the hills had depleted their stolen supplies faster than expected, and hunger made men's tongues sharp as knives. "We're rats hiding in holes," Tiro declared, pacing near the dying embers of their breakfast fire. "The coast is 3 days' march. We could steal a merchant ship, sail east beyond Rome's reach." Several younger slaves nodded eagerly. The promise of complete escape held powerful appeal, especially to those who had never known life beyond captivity. "And who among us knows how to sail?" Dimas challenged from where he sat, sharpening his blade. "We'd drown before reaching deep water. Better to build something here, in terrain we know. A fortress in these hills, hidden from Roman eyes, hidden until the first patrol spots our smoke? Or until winter comes?" Cassian's soft voice carried unexpected weight. The young Greek had grown bolder since their escape, though fear still showed in his darting eyes. "Rome won't simply forget about us. They'll send legions, not patrols. They'll burn these hills to ash rather than let escaped slaves mock their power." Queso watched the debate from the edge of camp, noting how men clustered around different speakers. The unity forged in revolt was fracturing under the weight of empty bellies and uncertain futures. Even the thrill of freedom had begun to sour as reality set in. "We stay together," he said finally, stepping forward. "Divided, we're just fugitives to be hunted down one by one. Together, we're a force they must respect." "Respect?" Cassian's laugh held no humor. "They'll respect us the way they respected the slaves they crucified along the Appian Way. One man's defiance is rebellion. 20 men's defiance is insurrection. They'll make examples of us all." Before Queso could respond, Rufus came sprinting into camp, chest heaving. The former house slave had been on watch at their southern lookout point. "Soldiers," he gasped. "2 patrols, moving up from the valley. They're checking every cave and hollow." The camp erupted into motion. Men grabbed weapons and supplies, ready to flee. Kaiso's voice cut through the panic like a blade. "Hold! Quiet, all of you." He turned to Rufus. "How far?" "Hour's march, maybe less. They're being thorough." "Then we have time." Kaiso pointed to the supplies. "Break camp. No trace left behind. Move everything to the high cave we found yesterday." He began assigning tasks with the same authority that had commanded respect in the fighting pits. "Marcus, take 4 men and lay false trails leading east. Dimas, your group conceals our real path. The rest carry what we can't afford to lose." They worked with desperate efficiency, scattering dirt over the fire pit, brushing away tracks, hauling food and weapons up to the new hiding place. Kaiso had drilled them in swift retreats since their first day in the hills, teaching the skills of survival he'd learned in his homeland. "Move like wolves," he'd told them. "Silent, alert, always ready to fade into shadow." Now that training paid off, as 20 men vanished into the wilderness, leaving barely a trace of their passage. From the high cave, they watched the Roman patrols sweep through their abandoned camp. The soldiers were thorough but frustrated, finding nothing but cold ashes. Their curses drifted up on the afternoon breeze. "They knew where to look," Cassian whispered. "The overseers who escaped that night. They must have told them about the hills." Queso nodded grimly. 2 of the pitmaster's trusted men had slipped away during the revolt. They would have run straight to the nearest garrison, eager to curry favor with tales of rebellious slaves. As darkness fell, tension coiled through their new shelter like a serpent. The cave was larger but colder than their previous camp. Men huddled in small groups, sharing what little food remained from their hurried evacuation. The sound of growling stomachs echoed off stone walls. "We can't keep running forever," Tiro muttered. "Sooner or later, they'll find us. Or winter will kill us if they don't." The words found fertile ground in hungry minds. Kaiso saw heads nodding in the darkness, heard the whispers of agreement. Even Dimas's dreams of a hidden stronghold seemed hollow now, faced with the reality of Rome's relentless pursuit. Near midnight, Kaiso lay awake on his thin blanket, listening to the night sounds of the cave. The steady breathing of exhausted men was punctuated by restless movement and quiet conversations. His years in the fighting pits had taught him to sleep lightly, alert for any threat. So he heard them clearly, the whispers of younger slaves, barely more than boys, huddled near the cave's entrance. "We could make it to the coast ourselves," one murmured. "3 or 4 moving quiet are harder to spot than 20. If we leave now, while everyone sleeps," another agreed. "Better than waiting here to die." Kaiso's hand tightened on the dagger beneath his blanket. He had won his freedom with that blade, cutting down the masters who had enslaved him. Now he might need it against the very men he'd helped liberate. The thought turned his stomach, but he forced himself to consider it. If some fled, others would follow. The group would splinter, become weak. Everything they'd fought for would crumble like sand. He lay still, listening to the whispers of desertion, feeling the weight of leadership heavy as iron chains. The real threat wasn't just the Roman patrols hunting them through the hills. It was fear itself, fear that could tear them apart more surely than any enemy blade. The waning moon cast silver shadows through the trees as Kaiso led his men along the ridge above the road. 20 pairs of feet moved silently through the underbrush, a skill honed by days of evading Roman patrols. Below, torchlight flickered as the caravan wound its way through the valley. 6 guards in front, 4 in back, Rufus whispered, his keen eyes picking out details in the darkness. 2 nobles in the covered wagon, 3 cartloads of goods, and chains, Dimas added grimly. "I hear iron rattling. They're moving slaves." Queso nodded, studying the caravan's slow progress. The noble's wagon was ornate, its white canvas visible even in the dim light. Around it, tired guards trudged alongside heavily laden carts. At the rear, a line of shadowy figures shuffled in chains. "Remember," Kaiso murmured to his men, "quick and quiet. No screaming, no prolonged fighting. We strike like lightning and vanish like smoke." He had drilled these tactics into them over the past days, teaching them to fight not as arena gladiators, but as hunters. They split into 2 groups, positioning themselves ahead and behind the caravan. Kaiso gave the signal, a low whistle like a night bird. The response came seconds later from the other group, ready in position. The first guard died without a sound, Kaiso's blade opening his throat from behind. Across the road, shadows detached themselves from the trees as his men struck. The remaining guards barely had time to draw their swords before being overwhelmed. "Please, mercy!" The noble's voice quavered from inside the wagon. "I carry letters from the governor." "I'm under imperial protection!" Queso ripped aside the canvas, revealing a fat man in expensive robes cowering beside a younger companion. Both wore golden rings and expressions of terror. "Imperial protection?" Queso's voice was soft, but carried clearly in the sudden silence. "Like the protection you give these people?" He gestured to the chained slaves, who stood watching with wide eyes. The noble babbled promises of gold, of silence, of safe passage. Kaiso dragged him from the wagon and threw him to his knees in the road dust. "Check the carts," he ordered his men. They found wine, grain, dried meat, and several heavy boxes of coins, tax collections bound for Rome. "Kill them quickly," Tiro suggested, eyeing the nobles, "before their screams bring patrols." But Kaiso was moving toward the line of chained slaves. They shrank back as he approached, expecting violence. Instead, he raised his sword and brought it down on their chains. The iron links shattered. "You're free," he said simply. His own men stared in confusion. "What are you doing?" Cassian demanded. "They'll run straight to the nearest garrison." "No," Queso continued, breaking chains. "They're villagers, farmers, sold for taxes they couldn't pay. They have homes to return to." The freed slaves stood uncertainly, rubbing raw wrists. One old man stepped forward, voice trembling. "The soldiers took everything. Our farms, our children, said we owed Rome more than our lives were worth. Take what you need from the carts, Caeso told them. Go home. Tell others what happened here. As his men distributed the caravan's goods, something unexpected happened. The freed villagers began to whisper Caeso's name, not in fear, but in blessing. One woman pressed a wooden charm into his hand, a household god of protection. The nobles? Tiro asked again, blade ready. Caeso considered the two men trembling in the road. Death had been his constant companion in the fighting pits. But this was different. Tie them, he decided. Leave them for their own patrols to find. Let them carry word that not all slaves die in chains. They worked quickly, splitting the supplies between themselves and the freed villagers. As they prepared to disappear back into the hills, the old man who had spoken earlier approached Caeso again. My village is an hour's walk north, he said quietly. We have deep cellars, hidden from Roman eyes. You and your men would find rest there, and grateful hearts. Caeso hesitated. Trust was dangerous, but hunger and exhaustion weighed heavily on his fighters, and they couldn't live forever in cold caves. The village was small, a cluster of humble houses set against the hillside. As they approached, dogs began barking, and people emerged carrying torches. For a moment, Caeso tensed, expecting shouts of alarm. Instead, the villagers welcomed them as liberators. Word of the caravan raid had already spread through the night. Women brought bread and cheese from secret stores. Children stared in wonder at the fighters who had freed their neighbors. Soon a fire burned in the village square, carefully screened from distant view. Wine liberated from the caravan flowed freely. For the first time since their escape, Caeso's men relaxed truly, sharing food and stories with people who saw them not as monsters or fugitives, but as heroes. A small girl, no more than 6, sat beside Caeso and solemnly offered him a piece of honeycomb. Her mother tried to pull her away, but he smiled, his first genuine smile in days. Thank you, little one. She studied his scarred face without fear. Is it true you killed the bad men who take people away? Hush, child, her mother scolded. But others had heard. Soon they were begging for the tale of the pit slave revolt. Even Caeso's fighters leaned in, proud to hear their deed retold. The girl began chanting his name, and others joined in. Not the bloodthirsty roar of the arena crowd, but something sweeter, a song of hope. Looking around the fire at his men's faces, Caeso saw not just escaped slaves, but warriors who had found a cause beyond mere survival. For one brief night, they were not running or hiding. They belonged. The warmth of the fire and the villagers' gratitude washed away the cold fear that had haunted them since their escape. Here, under the stars, they had found something worth far more than stolen gold. Dignity. Dawn crept over the hills, painting the village in pale gold. Caeso woke with a start, his fighter's instincts sensing something wrong before his mind could name it. The village square was quiet, the fire's ashes cold. His men slept scattered among the villagers' barns and cellars. He did a quick count of his fighters, a habit burned into him by days of running. Someone was missing. He counted again, dread building in his stomach. Cassian's gone, Nero said quietly, appearing beside him. The old veteran's remaining eye was grave, his sleeping spots cold. Pax missing too. Caeso swore under his breath. He should have seen this coming. Cassian's doubts had grown louder with each passing day, his fear of Rome's retribution eating at him like a disease. How long? Hours, by my guess, left in the darkest part of night. Around them, other fighters were stirring, noticing the absence. Whispers spread like ripples in a pond. Tiro gripped his sword hilt, face dark with anger. The little snake ran back to his masters. He'll lead them straight to us, Dymas growled. We should move now. But Nero held up a weathered hand. Listen to an old soldier. If he left hours ago, moving now changes nothing. They're already coming. He turned to Kaiso. Fear makes men do terrible things, turns brother against brother. I've seen it before. Kaiso nodded grimly. Wake everyone. Get the villagers into their cellars. We can't let them suffer for sheltering us. As his fighters rushed to prepare, Nero gripped Kaiso's arm. Remember this lesson. It's not the strong who betray, but the fearful. Cassian was too soft for this life. He chose the chains he knew over the freedom he feared. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. They posted watches, packed their supplies, planned escape routes. The villagers insisted on sharing what food they could spare, even knowing soldiers might come. Evening painted the sky blood-red when the first horn echoed across the hills. Kaiso was on the village edge, watching the southern road. Torches appeared in the growing darkness, dozens of them. Form up, he shouted. Protect the village. His fighters took positions behind walls and buildings as Roman soldiers emerged from the twilight. At their head walked Cassian, head bowed. Behind him, a century of heavily armed legionaries spread out in practiced formation. "Throw down your weapons!" the centurion bellowed. "Surrender, and you may yet live as slaves again." Kaiso's answer was a thrown spear that took a legionary in the throat. The night erupted into chaos. Steel clashed against steel. Arrows hissed through the darkness. The villagers had doused all fires, leaving Romans to stumble in the gloom while Kaiso's men struck from shadows they knew well. But there were too many soldiers. For each one that fell, two more pressed forward. Kaiso saw Tiro go down, then Rufus. Good men, fighters who had survived the pits only to die here. "Fall back," he ordered. "To the forest." They retreated step by step, leaving a trail of dead Romans. But the soldiers kept coming, their discipline overwhelming the fighters' desperate fury. Nero appeared at Kaiso's side, his sword red in the torchlight. "Go!" the old veteran shouted. "I'll hold them here." "No! Together! Listen to me one last time, boy." Nero's single eye blazed. "You're meant for more than dying here. The fire must not die with us." Before Kaiso could stop him, Nero charged the Roman line. His blade carved a bloody path, buying precious seconds for the others to retreat. A pilum took him in the side, but still he fought. Another spear struck his leg. He fell to one knee but kept swinging. Kaiso tried to reach him, but Dymas and two others dragged him back. "He chose this!" Dymas shouted. "Don't waste his sacrifice." The last Kaiso saw of his friend, Nero was laughing as he fell, taking 3 more Romans with him to the underworld. The old fighter's sword spun through the air. A final gift. Kaiso caught it, tears burning his eyes. They fled into the forest as Romans set fire to the village. Smoke turned the night sky orange, and screams followed them into the darkness. Only 5 had survived. Kaiso, Dymas, and 3 others, whose names blurred in the chaos of flight. They ran until their legs gave out, finally collapsing in a hidden glen. Kaiso clutched Nero's sword, its worn grip still warm. Behind them, the forest burned, Roman torches spreading the flames in their pursuit. "Keep moving," he gasped, forcing himself up. "We can't stop." They staggered on through the night, putting distance between themselves and the inferno. Every step carried them further from the dream of brotherhood they'd built. Every breath tasted of ash and betrayal. Kaiso's fingers traced the nicks in Nero's blade. Each one a battle survived, a lesson learned. His friend's last words echoed in his mind. "The fire must not die with us." Not the fire of burning villages, but the flame of defiance that had started in the fighting pits. They moved like wounded wolves through the darkness, their pack diminished but not destroyed. Behind them, the forest continued to burn, painting the night sky the color of vengeance. The morning sun filtered through dense branches as Kaiso and his 4 remaining fighters slogged through knee-deep swamp water. Their clothes were caked with mud, their wounds barely scabbed over. They hadn't eaten in 2 days, surviving on bitter roots and murky water. Queso's hand never left the hilt of Nero's sword. Every time he gripped it, memories flooded back. The old veteran's laugh, his quiet wisdom, his final stand against the Romans. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier. "We need to rest," Dimas whispered, helping Marcus, who limped from an arrow wound. The young fighter's face was pale with fever. They found a small rise in the swamp, barely dry enough to sit. As the others collapsed, Queso kept watch, scanning the tree line for pursuit. The Romans were still out there, hunting them like animals. "This is madness," Rufus muttered, wringing water from his cloak. "We can't keep running forever." "We should split up," Titus suggested. "Smaller groups move faster, draw less attention." Queso turned sharply. "That's what they want, to divide us. Pick us off one by one." "Like they picked off the others?" Rufus challenged. "How many died because we stayed together?" "Because we followed you." The words struck like physical blows. Queso saw again the faces of those who'd fallen. Nero, Tiro, all the others who'd trusted him. Their deaths weighed on his soul like chains, heavier than any the Romans had forged. "I never asked to lead you," he said quietly. "No," Dimas agreed, "but you did. And now, here we are, hunted, starving, while you chase some dream of freedom that gets more men killed every day." Queso had no answer. The doubt that had been gnawing at him since the night of betrayal grew stronger. Perhaps Cassian had been right. Perhaps fighting Rome was nothing but slow suicide. They moved again at dusk, following game trails through the swamp. The mosquitoes were maddening, the air thick with rotting vegetation. Marcus's fever had worsened. They had to half-carry him. Near midnight, distant torchlight froze them in place. Voices drifted through the trees, not soldiers this time, but the harsh commands of slave drivers. Queso signaled the others to stay low. He crept forward through the undergrowth, following the sound. Through the branches, he saw a column of chained peasants stumbling along a muddy road. Most were young men and women, some barely more than children. Armed guards drove them forward with whips. "Keep moving, you dogs!" a guard shouted. "The arena at Ardea doesn't pay for dead slaves." One elderly man stumbled, pulling others down with him. As a guard raised his whip, a young woman helped the old man up. "Please," she begged. "He's my father. He just needs water." The guard's whip cracked. "Water? You'll get water in the pits, mixed with your own blood." Queso's fingers tightened on Nero's sword. The blade seemed to pulse with memory. The roar of crowds, the taste of sand, the endless parade of men and women ground to dust for Roman entertainment. A peasant woman near the back of the column stumbled close to his hiding place. Her eyes widened when she saw him, but she made no sound. "Where are they taking you?" he whispered. "The provincial arena at Ardea," she breathed. "They say it's grander than the old fighting pits, that the new governor wants games worthy of Rome itself. They say a man named Septimus runs it, cruel as a whip. He buys the youngest and breaks them first." Queso's stomach turned. He knew what that meant. More slaves, bigger spectacles, death on an even greater scale. The woman must have read something in his face. Are you the one they speak of?" she whispered. "The pit slave who freed himself." Before he could answer, a guard's shout made her scramble back into line. The column shambled forward, chains rattling in the darkness. Queso retreated to where his men waited. They had heard everything. "No," Rufus said immediately. "We barely escaped the last fight." "We can't save everyone," Titus added. Queso stared down at Nero's sword, its worn grip smooth against his palm. He remembered his friend's final words. "The fire must not die with us." "I watched men die in those pits for 5 years," he said quietly. Good men, strong men, broken down day by day until nothing remained but fear and pain. I swore when we escaped that no one would suffer that fate again if I could stop it. And how many more must die for that oath? Dimas demanded. Kaiso traced the blade's edge with his thumb. Every nick, every scratch told a story of survival. But survival wasn't enough anymore. Nero had taught him that. He looked at his remaining fighters, men who had bled with him, suffered with him. Their faces were hard with exhaustion and doubt. They had lost so much already. But beyond them, he could still hear the rattle of chains, the crack of whips, the weeping of those bound for the arena, the same sounds that had haunted his nights for 5 years. His grip tightened on Nero's sword. In the darkness, its steel gleamed like a promise. No more pits, no more chains, no more broken men fighting for Roman pleasure. The blade was an oath now, and he would keep it or die trying. The arena at Ardea isn't just a pit, Caeso explained, sketching a rough map in the dirt. It's the governor's pride, his statement to Rome, which means it will be well guarded. His remaining fighters huddled around the crude drawing. Dawn was breaking, casting long shadows through the trees. They had spent the night observing supply wagons moving along the road to Ardea. 4 of us, against an arena full of guards? Rufus shook his head. It's suicide. 5, Marcus corrected weakly, still feverish but sitting up. I can still hold a sword. Caeso pointed to the wagon tracks. They're preparing for games. That means supplies, traders, workers coming and going. No one looks twice at another cart of goods. And how do we get weapons past the gates? Titus asked. The same way Nero did, Caeso replied, pulling out a worn leather sack, hidden in plain sight. He emptied the bag, pieces of bronze and iron, broken chains, dull blade fragments. To casual eyes, mere scrap metal for trading. But in skilled hands, they could become weapons. Dimas examined a length of chain. This could work, but the timing must be perfect. We strike at nightfall, Caeso said, when the guards change shifts and the torches cast the deepest shadows. They spent the day preparing. Caeso and Titus wrapped weapons in rags, concealing them among actual trade goods. Dimas and Rufus stole clothes from a merchant's washing line, transforming themselves into common traders. Marcus, too weak to fight, would drive their borrowed cart. As sunset approached, they joined the stream of traffic entering Ardea. Caeso kept his head down, letting his beard and dirt-stained clothes hide his features. His heart pounded as they approached the gates. A guard barely glanced at their cart. More scrap metal? For the arena's forge, Caeso mumbled, adopting a servile tone that tasted like bile in his mouth. Master blacksmith's expecting us. They were waved through. Inside, the arena rose before them, its stone walls stained orange by the setting sun. Unlike the illegal fighting pits, this was a proper Roman spectacle. Organized, efficient, and cruel. They found an empty stable to conceal the cart. As darkness fell, Caeso distributed the hidden weapons. Real swords replaced the scrap metal, shields emerged from grain sacks. The holding cells will be underground, he whispered. That's where they'll keep the new slaves. Dimas hefted his chain like a whip. The guards won't expect an attack from inside. Remember, Caeso gripped Nero's sword. We move as one, no hesitation. Every moment of surprise is precious. They slipped through torch-lit corridors, passing servants and slaves who barely glanced at them. Their disguises held until they reached the first guard post. You there? This area's restricted. Caeso's blade opened the guard's throat before he could finish. The body hadn't hit the ground before they were moving, fast and silent, down the stairs to the holding cells. The familiar stench hit him. Sweat, fear, and hopelessness. Rows of cells lined the corridor, packed with captured peasants. Among them, he recognized faces from the chain gang they'd followed. "Keys!" he hissed. Rufus stripped them from the dead guard's belt. Cell doors creaked open. Confused faces peered out, uncomprehending until they saw the freed prisoners ahead of them running. Then the alarm bells began to ring. "Now!" Kaiso roared. "Dimas! The main gates!" The Nubian giant charged forward, his chain whirling like a deadly snake. It caught the first rushing guard across the face, sending him crashing into his companions. Kaiso and the others struck from behind, their blades finding gaps in armor. Chaos erupted. Freed prisoners grabbed fallen weapons, their fear turning to fury. Guards poured down the stairs, but found themselves fighting an uprising instead of escaped slaves. Kaiso fought his way up, Nero's sword singing with each stroke. He recognized the moves, the same ones that had kept him alive in the pits, now turned against his former masters. Blood sprayed across stone walls. Screams echoed through corridors. The fighting spilled into the arena itself, where torches cast wild shadows across the sand. "The Overseer!" someone shouted. In the master's box, Kaiso looked up to see a familiar figure trying to flee. Septimus, the arena's chief overseer, known for his creative cruelty. Their eyes met across the distance. "Demas!" Kaiso pointed with his sword. "Cut off his escape!" The Nubian's chain snaked out, wrapping around a support beam. He pulled himself up with incredible strength, vaulting into the viewing box. Septimus turned to run, but found his path blocked. Kaiso reached him moments later. The overseer drew a jeweled dagger, his hand shaking. "You're just slaves," he spat. "Animals! You can't—" Kaiso kicked the blade away. Below, the freed prisoners gathered, their faces lit by torch fire as they watched. "You filled these sands with blood," Kaiso said quietly. "Now you'll taste what you forced others to drink." He dragged Septimus to the edge of the box. The overseer's eyes widened as he realized what was coming. "Please, I'll pay you. Whatever you want. I want justice," Kaiso's voice carried across the arena. "The same justice you dealt to others." He threw Septimus over the rail. The overseer landed hard on the bloody sand, surrounded by the very people he had condemned to death for sport. The crowd moved in, their chains now weapons, their fear turned to vengeance. Septimus screamed once, then was lost beneath the surge of bodies. Kaiso watched from above, Nero's sword still gripped tight. The blade seemed lighter now, as if some debt had been repaid. In the torchlight, the arena's sand turned red. Not with the blood of slaves this time, but with the blood of those who had spilled it for profit and pleasure. Dawn broke over Ardea as smoke rose from the arena. The sounds of fighting had faded, replaced by something else. Hundreds of voices calling out in the growing light. Kaiso stood at the arena's highest point, watching as freed slaves streamed through the broken gates into the streets. "They're not running away," Rufus said beside him, amazement in his voice. "They're gathering." He was right. Instead of scattering into the countryside, the freed prisoners were forming groups in the plaza. Some still held bloody weapons, others clutched broken chains, but none fled. "Look there!" Dimas pointed toward the city's outer districts. Torches were appearing in windows. Doors opened as common people emerged, drawn by the commotion. A woman's voice rose above the crowd. "My brother was taken for the pits." "Where is he?" "Here," came an answering cry. "I'm here, sister." More voices joined in, families finding loved ones thought lost forever, slaves recognizing fellow villagers. The plaza filled with tearful reunions and cries of joy. But there was something else building, anger, not just from the freed fighters, but from the townspeople themselves. "They took my son last month," a weathered farmer shouted. "Said he owed taxes he couldn't pay." "My husband, too," another voice joined in. "Called him a thief and sold him to the pits." The crowd's mood shifted. Years of helpless rage found its voice. Stories of injustice poured out, sons and brothers stolen, debts used as excuses for enslavement. corrupt officials feeding the endless appetite for fresh bodies in the arena. Kaiso descended to the plaza, Nero's sword still in hand. The crowd parted before him, voices hushing. He saw fear in some eyes. He was, after all, the killer they'd heard whispered about. But he also saw hope. A young boy pushed forward. "Are you him? The one who burned the fighting pits?" Queso nodded slowly. The boy's face lit up. "I knew you'd come. They took my father. But now we'll find him, won't we?" Before Queso could answer, horns blared from the city walls. The garrison was mobilizing. "They'll try to contain this," Dimas warned. "We should leave while we can." But the crowd wasn't dispersing. If anything, it was growing larger. More townspeople arrived, carrying makeshift weapons, farm tools, kitchen knives, wooden clubs. An old woman stepped forward, her gray hair wild around her face. "My grandson died in those pits," she said clearly. "I won't run anymore. None of us will." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Queso felt the shift in the air, the same energy he'd sensed the night his fellow slaves rose up against their masters. "The garrison will have archers," he warned loudly. "They'll shoot into the crowd without mercy." "Then we'll need shields," a blacksmith called out. "I have materials in my forge." "And we know the back streets better than any soldier," a street vendor added. "We can outmaneuver them." More voices joined in, offering resources, knowledge, hiding places. What had begun as a jailbreak was transforming into something larger, a city rising against its oppressors. Queso turned to his fighters. "Spread out. Help organize them. Show them how to move, how to fight." His men nodded, understanding. They'd learned these skills the hard way in the pits. Now they could teach others to survive. News traveled fast. From the city gates, Queso could see movement in the countryside. Torches appeared on distant farms. Voices carried across fields. "More coming," Rufus reported. "Whole villages by the look of it." He was right. The roads leading to Ardea filled with people. Farmers, shepherds, laborers. Many carried tools that could serve as weapons. Children ran ahead of their parents, excitement replacing fear. A messenger arrived, breathless. "The mines!" he gasped. "The slaves in the copper mines! They're rising too! Breaking their chains!" Another runner came from the opposite direction. "The quarry workers have overthrown their overseers! They're marching here!" Queso felt the momentum building, like a wave about to break. This was beyond anything he'd planned. His raid on the arena had struck a spark, but the tinder had been laid long before. In every injustice, every cruelty, every person stolen from their family. He walked through the crowd, touching shoulders, meeting eyes. These weren't trained fighters like his pit brothers. They were ordinary people who had finally reached their breaking point. A young woman grabbed his arm. "My sister," she said urgently. They took her to another arena, near the coast. "Will you help us free her too?" Before Queso could answer, others pressed forward with similar pleas. Map makers offered to show paths to other fighting pits. Merchants volunteered knowledge of guard rotations. Stable hands promised horses. The sun climbed higher, revealing the true scale of what was happening. The plaza could no longer contain the crowd. They spilled into side streets, onto rooftops. Messengers raced between groups, coordinating movements. From his years in the pits, Queso had learned to read crowds, to sense the moment when bloodlust or fear could turn them deadly. But this was different. There was anger, yes, but also purpose, organization, hope. 3 days later, Queso stood atop a windswept ridge, his cloak whipping in the cold mountain air. Below, in the misty valley, torchlight revealed the gathering might of Rome. Cohorts of legionaries assembling in precise rows, their armor glinting like fish scales in the dawn light. "I count at least 2,000, Dimas muttered, crouching beside him. "Maybe more arriving by the hour." Queso nodded silently. The soldiers' campfires dotted the valley like fallen stars, each light representing dozens of trained killers. Their orders would be simple: crush the revolt, capture its leader, make examples to discourage others. But as Kaiso's gaze swept across the wider landscape, other fires caught his attention. Far to the east, orange blazes marked 3 villages where slaves had risen against their masters. To the south, more flames flickered along the coastline, evidence of port workers throwing off their chains. And to the west, in the hills where copper mines scarred the earth, plumes of smoke rose like victory banners. "They can't stop it now," Rufus said quietly, reading Queso's expression. The fire's spreading too fast. He was right. What had begun as one desperate raid had ignited something larger. Each success inspired others. Every freed slave carried the story to new places. Even now, messengers were racing between communities, coordinating actions, sharing tactics learned in those first bloody days. Queso touched the hilt of Nero's sword, remembering his friend's last words about keeping the fire alive. At first, he'd thought it meant simply surviving, carrying on their personal revolt. Now he understood the deeper truth. True rebellion couldn't be contained in one place or led by one man. It had to spread, to take root in thousands of hearts. A scout appeared from the shadows, breathing hard. "News from the coast," he reported. 3 more fighting pits destroyed. The slaves joined with local fishermen. They're seizing boats, freeing others along the shore. "And the mining towns?" Queso asked. "Better than we hoped. The overseers fled when they saw the torches coming. The miners are arming themselves with their own tools." Queso allowed himself a grim smile. Rome's greatest weapon had always been fear. The belief that resistance was futile, that the mighty empire could crush any rebellion. But fear was breaking down. Hope was proving more contagious than terror. He turned to address the 30 fighters gathered on the ridge, his most trusted companions from the original revolt. Their faces were dirty, their clothes ragged, but their eyes burned with purpose. "Rome has finally noticed us," he said, voice carrying on the wind. "They've sent their legions to make an example. They expect us to mass our forces here, to die gloriously in one great battle." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. It was the warrior's way, to face death head-on, to seek glory in final combat. "But we're not here to die," Queso continued. "We're here to live free, and to help others live free." He pointed to the scattered fires across the landscape. "Look there. Every flame is a victory. Every torch passed from hand to hand spreads our message. If we die here, those flames might sputter and die. But if we scatter—" "Scatter?" Dimas interrupted, frowning. "After everything we've built?" Queso gripped his shoulder. "We built this together, brother. But now we must trust others to carry it forward. Each of us knows different lands, different tongues. We can teach what we've learned, how to organize, how to fight, how to survive." Understanding dawned in their faces. They had all seen how quickly common people could become warriors when given hope and knowledge. Their skills, hard-won in the pits, could now serve a greater purpose. "Take 10 trusted fighters each," Queso instructed. "Move in small groups. The mountains are vast. Rome cannot watch every pass, every trail. When you find good people, teach them. When you find slaves in chains, free them. But never mass your forces in one place." "And you?" Rufus asked quietly. Queso's hand tightened on Nero's sword. "I'll keep moving. Draw their attention. Let them chase shadows while the real work spreads." The sky was lightening, pink fingers of dawn reaching across the mountains. Below, horns began to sound as the Roman forces prepared to march. "They'll hunt us all," someone said. "Good." Queso's smile was wolf-like. "Let them waste their strength chasing ghosts while we light fires they cannot extinguish. Every slave who breaks free will carry our story. Every village that rises will inspire 10 more." He looked at each face in turn. Men who had begun as strangers in the pits, now bonded by blood and shared purpose. "We are no longer just fighters," he said. "We are the spark that lights the flame. Carry it well, brothers." One by one, they clasped hands with Kaiso, exchanging final words, sharing quiet promises to meet again when circumstances allowed. Then they melted away into the pre-dawn shadows, moving in different directions with their chosen companion. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.